I'm absolutely delighted today to be able to welcome Dr. Graham Woodgate. Graham is a Principal Teaching Fellow in Environmental Sociology of the Americas at the UCL Institute of the Americas. Graham has done a wonderful sort of favour for us, really. He's just come from a couple of hours or more of teaching. And he apologises if his voice is starting to go, but we've mic'd him up, so we should all be okay. But if anyone can't hear, do sort of shout out. Graham is someone whose work I've sort of admired from afar, both in terms of his academic work, but also his teaching as well. And I was just saying that he taught one of our students on an option module last year, and I heard very, very good things about the really quite transformative and inspiring teaching that's going on at the Institute of the Americas. Graham's research focuses broadly on nature-society relations, and particularly the emerging field of agroecology, which he's going to tell us quite a bit more about. Before entering academia, Graham trained as a forester. He also tells me that he's still a farmer as well. He then gained a PhD in political ecology from Y College, undertaking research in central Mexico. And then during the 1990s, coordinated an education program between UK universities and Mexican farming systems research institutions. Graham joined the Institute of Latin American Studies, which I guess was part of the University of London at that time, back in 2002, and then that moved to be one of the founding members of the UCL Institute of the Americas in about 2012.
Yes.
Yeah. So a little bit of interesting history of UCL's acquisition of different parts of the university. In addition to his academic work, Graham undertakes environmental consultancies, especially around issues to do with forest stewardship. And Graham is a member of the editorial board of some really significant journals, particularly Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems. As I said, I'm delighted to welcome Graham today. He's going to talk to us about transformative agroecology beyond sustainable intensification, which was a point that rose from our speaker last week. And I'd like to ask you all to join me in welcoming Graham today.
Thanks very much, Matt, for inviting me and such a wonderful introduction as well. I was just saying, Matt, I pondered over time exactly what I wanted to try and talk about today, and I hope that as a result of that I have got isn't too much of a jumble. But basically, when I'm talking about transformative agroecology, I'm talking about an approach to understanding agriculture, rural communities, rural development that I developed, I became part of when I joined in with other colleagues from the Americas in 1996 at the University of Cordoba in southern Spain, which was a 10-week intensive in-house program, and it attracted students from all over Latin America, and the teachers on the 10-week intensive course came from universities all around the world. So I met up with Steve Gleesman, and for anybody who knows anything about agroecology, you should know that name, and Miguel Altieri, who I think published the first edited collection in agroecology in 1985 or something like that. So that's how I got involved in the transformative agroecology that they talk about. We're calling it transformative agroecology now because, and beyond sustainable intensification, basically because the ideas of agroecology have been taken up by corporate agriculture, and we're trying to distinguish ourselves from that agroecology-as-natural science. So for me, transformative agroecology is agroecology as agricultural practice, as agroecological science, and really importantly, as social movement. So practice, science, and social movement. Okay, now I don't have an awful lot of time, and I've got a very bad reputation for spending an awful lot of time talking, so I'll get straight on. This is an outline. I think I may not get to this last bit, which is much more philosophical, theoretical in terms of presenting ontology and epistemology, etc. So So I'll go through the first ones, and hopefully that will give you a good overview of what I understand as agroecology. And I think there's a long history to this, and I have linked it to some of these important works and moments in time. So from Thomas More's Utopia in 1516, in which he critiques the impacts of sheep farming on the rural population of England. Basically, your sheep that once were contained have now become so voracious that they eat up villages, towns, and entire populations. Gerard Winstanley, Diggers and Levellers, who said that people were behaving, so he gives a critique of capitalism and its impact in the countryside, saying that when man takes to buying and selling the land, they raise some people up and they cast some people down. A couple of hundred years forward, Chernyshevsky's novel What Is to Be Done, which he wrote just after the emancipation of the Russian peasantry in 1861, and which was a motivation for the development of the Narodnik movement, Narodniki, which were Russian intelligentsia. Narodniki, any Russian speakers? Narodniki in Russian means towards the people. So it's a movement towards the people, and the intellectuals went out into the countryside and they were talking about the peasants about how they might take over the resources of the large landed estates from which they had been freed and develop their own form of community agriculture. They weren't received very well, unfortunately, and didn't have a large impact. F.H. King, who was the first director of the United States Department of Agriculture, wrote a book in 1911 called Farmers of 40 Centuries, after a visit out to China, Japan, and Korea, where he was absolutely fascinated about how it was possible for people to continue producing productively on the same land for over 4,000 years, 4,000 years. And then Albert Howard, our own UK scientist, who was also the colonial director of agriculture in India, I think, for a short while, but worked at Y College, so I'm going to bring him in there, because he worked at my alma mater. And he wrote an agricultural testament in the 1940s, based on the research that he'd undertaken in India. And basically he says in that, I went out to India to teach people how to farm, and I hadn't been there very long before I realised that they knew everything they needed to know about how to farm, and I had to learn from them. And a key message in these two publications is that global prosperity, and I use the term global to mean everybody within one's remit rather than necessarily globally around the world, but these people were thinking about global prosperity for all was dependent on the maintenance of soil fertility by the efforts of those that were actually on and farming the land. So, that was a brief introduction and some kind of like background to agroecology as I've understood it, to see similar movements. I didn't sort of mention China, but China's theory of the peasant economy works well with agroecology too, I think. So what I want to do now is to move forward and start to think about some of the generic impacts of agriculture on the environment. And you'll see I'm using the term agri-cultures. So these are the cultures of the field, distinct and different in different places, but with two key models that I want to talk about, using agroecology to critique the other. So all agriculture involves ecosystem modification to maximize the share of light, nutrients and water available to crops. All agriculture therefore involves the removal of some trees. And since the advent of agriculture, global forest cover has decreased from estimates of somewhere around 70 to 75%. I think it's actually just dipped below 30% now. That's a figure from one of the State of the World's Forest reports. And Ruddiman, in the Ruddiman hypothesis, hypothesizes, we talk about global warming today, but he hypothesizes, he estimates that agrarian civilizations prior to agricultural industrialization through the removal of trees and the release of carbon stored in the biomass, both above ground and below ground biomass, was responsible for a mean global temperature rise of perhaps 1 degree C prior to industrialization. Of course, the industrialization of agriculture and the food system based on fossil hydrocarbons has many additional negative environmental impacts, as well as being a much more significant contributor to global warming and climate change. Indeed, if we consider the global food system as a whole, estimates vary, but we're talking about something between 30 and 50% of total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions being related to the global food system. So land cover changes as agriculture develops. There's genetic modification from simple domestication and selective breeding. If we think about the region that I'm particularly interested in, then we get our maize, our climbing beans, squash, cockatoo, tomatoes, avocados, cocoa and vanilla come from Mesoamerica, so from southern Mexico down to the top of South America, and South America is responsible for our potatoes, sweet potatoes, lots of other roots and tubers, as well as peanuts and pineapples. So these things are modified genetically by selective breeding. And selective breeding is carried out to enhance specific traits in relation to the ecological conditions, this is pre-industrial agriculture, in relation to the ecological conditions and cultural preferences of people. Whereas today, genetic modification tends to be much more in relation to the economics of production. So you basically create the ecological conditions for your crop rather than using crops that fit into the ecological niche. And you're producing for a global market, so local cultural preferences are not of any particular import. And through these pre-industrial processes of development, we see in Peru, maybe rather than the 4 or 5 potato varieties you might buy here, in Peru, 4,000 or 5,000 different varieties, distinct different varieties of potato. Some people say 6,000, some count 6,000 varieties of potato. Whereas in Mexico, in one municipality alone, these are 2 researchers from the Institute for Agricultural and Rural Science of the University of the State of Mexico. And in one municipality there are more than 60 different maize varieties, and that's then working on a very environment facility funded in situ genetic conservation project for maize. And the production and processing of crops in this way over time has gone hand in hand with the development of specific cultures. So I talk about agri with a hyphen in it, cultures, a term introduced by Jules Fitty, I think, in the 1990s. And a short quote there from Journal of Biodiversity Conservation, I think, Barfield et al. Management practices have co-evolved, and that's a key term in agroecology, co-evolved in relation to local environmental fluctuations and have been carried forward by both biophysical and social features, genotypes, artifacts, written accounts, as well as embodied rituals, art, or traditions of self-organized system of rules. So we're talking about cultures, agricultures, in themselves. And as Altieri and Toledo, who wrote a paper on the agroecological revolution in Latin America in 2011 says that their continued existence is a testament to their remarkable resiliency in the face of continual environmental and economic change. So this is agriculture, where agriculture emerged from, some descriptions of it. I want to move now to think about 20th century agricultural industrialization. The 20th century in agricultural industrialization was, well, when I worked in Mexico, I worked in the Santa Catalina Research Station in the state of Mexico, and that was the place that Norman Borlaug arrived to, and he was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation in the 1950s to go down and establish CIMIT, So it was part of a program. CIMMYT is the Center for the Improvement of Maize and Wheat, which is located in Mexico. All part of the consultative group on international agricultural research, which also includes the IFPRI, which is the International Food Policy Research Institute. But Paula went down to Mexico. Various centres were set up elsewhere. CIAC, which is the International Centre for Tropical Agriculture in Colombia, and CIP, the International, you might guess, International Centre for Potato in Peru in 1971. All of these institutions were involved in the transmission, the transfer of techniques and practices of agricultural industrialization. So mechanisation, high-yielding varieties, called high-yielding varieties in the literature. I prefer to call them high-response varieties because they produce a high yield when they have all of the industrial inputs that they need. If you try to grow them on land without those inputs, they'll probably yield less than native breeds of maize. And those were all transferred to the south in a process known as the Green Revolution. So if we start to think about that critically, thinking about 20th century agricultural industrialization, we can make reference to some ideas that have come out of people like Philman Michael and Harriet Friedman. And their idea of food regimes of accumulation based around food. And they talk about the progression, they diverge in how they characterize the current global food regime. Michael talks about the corporate food regime. Harriet Friedman talks about the environmental corporate food regime. But basically these food regimes can be understood as networks of institutions, from the research institutions such as CIMMYT, IRI, the International Rice Research Institution in the Philippines, funding agencies, national governments, which are responsible, and importantly, corporations which are responsible for the spreading of these technologies around the world. And this corporate food regime, the regime that we live in today, I don't know where you got your lunch from today, and whether you have any idea where the ingredients for your lunch came from, how they were processed, what were the conditions under which the people working to produce them worked. But it becomes like he characterizes it as a food from nowhere. And no idea where this food comes from, it's food. And he then goes on to talk about, well, it's not really food, it's food-like substances. They have various ingredients put into it, but it doesn't really resemble anything that you might consider as food if you were to start from scratch and make a meal for yourself. And this is linked, this corporate food regime is linked to the idea that the importance of global food security, and that means that everybody should have secure access to sufficient food for their reproduction. But it's an idea that I'm going to contest, because global food security could be achieved as Eric Holton-Menes from the Food First Institute in California, in Oakland, California, pointed out, that could be achieved from 20 to 50,000 massive farms worldwide. We could achieve food security. But what happens to the 2 billion people in the world that couldn't afford to access that food and who currently rely on their own labour to produce their own food and their own communities to produce their own food? So this agricultural industrialization in the 20th century towards an idea of global food security certainly resulted in a massive increase in production. But land ownership also became more concentrated. Small-scale, family-based, community-oriented food production was marginalised and impoverished. Soils have been degraded. Most of the industrially farmed soils today basically have very little or no organic matter content. They're basically seen as inert substrates of which you add the necessary ingredients in order to make them produce. And so soils are degraded, wild and agricultural biodiversity have been depleted, water, atmosphere, food, and people are contaminated. And people are seriously contaminated by this. I don't know whether anybody knows much of Latin America, but there's a movement of mothers in Latin America from this big area, which is a big part of Argentina, southern Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, which Syngenta announced and called the United Republic of Soy. So it's just a massive area of soy farming, genetically modified soy, farmed on a massive scale, sprayed with aeroplanes, and now there are severe and growing cases of, just trying to think of the correct term, but congenital abnormalities produced by the mothers of these children's exposure, and there are various court cases going on in order to try and get some kind of recompense for those impacts. We might understand this then, I don't want to necessarily go into it in detail, but if you are aware of Polanyi's work, The Great Transformation, he talks about basically the development of liberal capitalism and how that undermines the livelihoods of ordinary people who must then turn to the state and seek some kind of redress. This is a great agricultural transformation. It changes how agriculture is structured and organized, and it has significant implications for these people. I think I'm not going to go through the next slide. I thought I'd taken that out. So who are the winners and losers of the Green Revolution? Well, so here I'm referring to Eric Horton-Ennis and Ellen Peabody in 2008 in their study, literature review study. They estimated that germplasm, so the basic genetic resources from the small scale communities, all these hundreds and hundreds of different maize varieties throughout Central and Latin America, that germplasm for breeding contributed something like $10 billion a year to US corn and soy production in the 1970s and 80s. Questions of intellectual property rights there. Those maize was domesticated something like 10,000 years ago, and 10,000 years of selective breeding seems to have no intellectual property right whatsoever, whereas 4 years in the laboratory seems to take complete intellectual property rights over these resources. 1/3 of the improved seed that was produced by CIMMYT, remember this is the Center for the Improvement of Maize and Wheat in Mexico, was actually appropriated by northern seed companies. And the farmers and the environment suffered. Fertilizers applications in Central America increased from 80 to 120 kilograms per hectare with 45 million ton a year in grain production. But in that same period of time, the average yield per hectare decreased by 50%. So that's telling us something. It's telling us that the technology is not fantastic in those conditions, and it's telling us that most of that production was actually a result of an expanded agricultural area rather than increased production per unit area. And so some of the impacts you get, this is a traditional milpa in Mexico, cultivated just probably sown. You can see that no chemicals being applied to it. There's a slight green hue there as the seeds are coming back again. A carefully constructed terrace wall backed by agave cactuses held in place. You can't see it very well, but running down through the middle of the plot there is a system of little holes in the ground. They're called lock and spill drains, zanjas in Spanish, and they work to reduce soil erosion. When you bring in the Green Revolution technology, which was forced on the population in this municipality, it's the same municipality where I showed you all the varieties of maize. This was the impact. Why was that the impact? It was because what the technology allowed the farmers to do, they're inventive, they're creative, they have livelihoods, they manage their resources in different ways, and what it enabled them to do was to take the herbicide that they'd been given, apply everything at the beginning of the year, and then leave. Go and find a job in Mexico City to earn some cash. They couldn't do that before the chemicals because you have to continually manually weed by hand if you want to keep production going without chemicals. So When you're doing that, you walk around. Any good farmer walks the land every day if they can. Depends how big your farm is, I guess. But when the heavy rains came, as soon as they saw erosion starting, they deal with it. So it might have pushed a rock out of the terrace wall. You're walking around every day, you see that's happened, you put it back in, you don't get that problem. When you leave to the city, you're not there, there's nobody to repair it. And a small rill, like developing a field, ends up as a gully and then ends up as what soil scientists, geologists will call badlands, where all of the topsoil, the soil's gone, and it's gone down to a very hard duripan layer of hardened clay. And going back to Barthel again, they say agricultural industrialization in the 20th century had a rate of biodiversity loss that is placed many species onto extinction trajectories. And it's now well established that the current loss of biodiversity in agro-ecosystem also erodes fundamental ecosystem services that underlie the resilience of production, such as soil fertility, pollination, and natural pest control, what are referred to today as ecosystem services. So, I don't think I'll spend a lot of time, but this is going back quite a long way. This is how I conceptualize this transition from gatherer-hunter systems. I wanted to mention today because because of the building we're in, because these ideas came to me when I was reading a paper by Warwick Bray, who is a professor of archaeology, of Latin American archaeology, and based in the institute here. And he had pointed out that in the transition from gatherers and hunters to agriculture, there will come a point in time, and this is important for where we are today, there comes a point in time at which it's not possible to go back, because agriculture has allowed the population to increase. And now the population is too big to go back to hunting and gathering. And what I'm going to suggest to you today, we've got significant issues. That's what we need to get back to now, a form of agriculture, a natural form of agriculture which can be sustained over the long term through the natural processes rather than through the continual application of chemicals derived from oil. Because we're running out of oil, and the continued use of those chemicals is causing severe environmental implications. And we move to a system today where society is completely distinct from nature. In fact, you start talking to people about nature and what's natural, and absolutely crazy conversations, because people have lost that connection with nature. We've got a situation today where society is bearing the major costs rather than nature of sustaining the food system, and we're now managing the environment in order to control the negative production externalities of the food system. So agroecology is different to that industrial agricultural development model, and it begins with the agricultural practices of farmers in the field, and seeks to learn from and build upon ecological principles and place-based biocultural knowledge and social structures that can support long-term ongoing food production, so that we could all be farmers of 40 centuries in F.H. King's terms. Agroecology, transformative agroecology, works with farmers to reduce their dependency on the institutions of the corporate food regime. That's the agroecology that I'm involved with. And join with producers and consumers of food in their struggles, and you'll be having another director seminar on slow food movements later in the term, I think. To producers and consumers of food in their struggles to defend themselves against the commoditization of land, labour, knowledge, genetic resources. This could be a Polanyian counter movement, because these also fit, these are the categories, these first two are Polanyi's fictitious commodities. They're turned into commodities by capitalism, but they can't be considered as real commodities because they were never produced for sale and production in the first place. So our land, labour, knowledge and genetic resources and food have been transformed into commodities, and there is a counter movement which we'll come to shortly. So the alternative to that is the idea of food sovereignty. And you can see I put Via Campesina's logo down at the bottom. Food sovereignty, the idea of food sovereignty is claimed by Via Campesina anyway. I'm pretty sure I've heard it well before that, but in 1993-96 they introduced this idea of food sovereignty. And so we've got a completely different set of strategies for creating food sovereignty. I haven't got time to go into that detail. But basically food sovereignty entails the right to adequate, affordable, healthy, and importantly, culturally appropriate food, not food-like substances or food from nowhere, culturally appropriate food. The right to produce genuine agrarian reform, give people access to the land, protection of national markets against dumping, and the right of every country or people to define their own agriculture and food policies. And they have adopted agroecology, not least, I'm sure, because people like Peter Rossett, who is one of the key contributors to the Transformative Agroecology debate, is actually a technical advisor to Via Campesina. Altieri's worked with Via Campesina, Gleason's worked with Via Campesina. And I think you had a representative of a Via Campesina affiliate come to run your lunch.
Landworkers Alliance.
So Via Campesina is the world's largest social movement. It represents something like 200 million small farmers worldwide. Quickly thinking in agroecology about the agroecology of agricultural practice itself, and thinking about those two different forms of agriculture, the corporate food regime and agroecology and food sovereignty. If we think about energy efficiency, very interesting book if you want to read it, a book by a guy called Gene Wilkin in 1987 called Good Farmers, which is an exploration of different farming practices in Central America and Mexico. EROI is energy return on input, sometimes put down as energy return on energy input, but EROI, energy return on input. From manual milker, and that's the maize, squash, maybe chili and other plants integrated together, grown together. When that production is purely manual, with a digging stick to find where you're going to put the seeds and stuff, and there's no animal traction, you can get a maximum maybe of 30 calories out for every 1 calorie of energy you invest. If you introduce draft animals, that figure has to go down because you have to feed and sustain your draft animals, but you can still have a positive energy return on input, up to 10 calories for every calorie that you input. If we look at the energy return on input of industrial agriculture, basically what we're seeing is that they're less than 1. And sometimes, well, I said 10 to 1, I was going to say up to 15. You can use up to 15 calories of energy input to produce 1 calorie of food. So basically, what you've eaten for lunch today is oil transformed into food. It's had a huge, massive subsidy from fossil energy. If we look at productivity of the two agricultures, we have to decide whether we're talking about labour, land, or total factor productivity. Industrial agriculture, the corporate food regime will claim that peasant farmers can never feed the world because they're not productive enough. So what are they talking about? They're talking about labour productivity, but we also have to think about what Marx would have called the organic composition of labour, what technology, what capital are people working with. Because if you're driving a big combine harvester, you can harvest maybe 8, maybe even more, 8 hectares of maize a day. If you're harvesting maize manually by hand, it could take one person 15, maybe 20 days to harvest a hectare of maize. But you have to think about the capital that they're using. So in terms of land productivity, that's the unit per unit area, what we find is that these manual, low-tech, traditional, I don't like using that word too much, locally place-based agricultures, if we look at the Mesoamerican milpa, the classic maize, squash and beans system of central Mexico, that produces maybe 50 or more % more food and 100% more organic residue per unit area than industrial production. So in terms of how much you can produce on a unit of land, manual agriculture is more productive. If you think about carbon balance, well, I said at the beginning, industrial agriculture is a very, very significant source of carbon emissions. Agroecological production, especially where you're combining perennial crops with annual crops, is actually a very good mechanism for storing carbon in the soil. So they actually absorb carbon. So they've got significant climate change mitigation potential. As set out in international documents, even the United Nations Trade and Development, United Nations Trade and Development, they are now starting to talk about the importance of agroecological production as well. And in terms of resilience, these traditional polycultures, where you've got lots of different crops mixed together, which you can't do in industrial systems because you can't then, it's not possible to have a machine that will harvest maize and beans at the same time. They actually suffer significantly less damage during and recover significantly faster following extreme weather events. That are associated with climate change. And there are good examples of this from throughout Latin America, where that Central America is hurricane basically, and uses for. And it also allows them far more adaptive capacity. Just a picture of conventional, traditional agriculture in Mexico. So, there are two competing agroecologies, that's what I'm saying. Transformative agroecology is this agroecology that I want to talk more about now. What has happened this century is many of the ideas of agroecology, having initially been roundly rejected by institutions of the corporate food regime, is now being co-opted. And you can see it in the academic press. There are people complaining about, you see these articles published on agroecology, some of them are talking about social movements, some of them are talking about science, some of them are doing anthropologies of production. We need to be clear, agroecology, the science of agroecology is what we need to make industrial agriculture sustainable. It's a different idea. It's around the sustainable intensification idea. And it's probably not very sustainable, not unless some way can be found to wean ourselves from fossil fuels. You might say biofuels, but biofuels take land that's important for producing food. So transformative agroecology has got a much deeper social and political foundation than agroecology-as-natural science. It's transdisciplinary, it's participatory, and it's action-oriented. It's oriented towards the transformation of agro-food systems from the bottom up. So I'm linking back to those first works and ideas that I put up on the first slide. And aims to reduce dependency on external inputs, commoditized knowledge and petrochemical technologies, increase functional diversity, etc. Optimize productivity across different ecosystem services. So, basic introduction to agroecology, something I'm just going to refer to the work of Altieri and Victor Manuel Toledo of the Institute of Ecology in Mexico, in their paper, where I think they overdo it a bit in this paper, to be honest, but they talk about an agroecological revolution in Latin America. They say an emerging agroecological revolution is creating new and unexpected changes directed at restoring local self-reliance as and that revolution has taken hold in 5 key geographic locations within the region. In the Andes, Central America and Mexico. In the Andes, supportive institutions and government policy have given new life and meaning to the idea of biocultural heritage, that idea that came from conservation biologists I mentioned earlier. And so we have, now how they translate into practice is another thing, but we have ideas such
such as Vivir Bien and Buen Vivir in Latin America, which are alternatives. They're post-development discourses based on relational ontologies, seeing people, understanding people as in relation to other living beings and the world around them. In Central America, the campesino movement is the farmer-to-farmer movement is important. So farmers learning from each other. And if you actually look at the agricultural revolution in this country when it occurred in the 18th century, it happens in exactly the same way. You've got people like Cope at Norfolk, Jeffrey Tull, Arthur Young, people travelling around the country, learning from different farmers, farmers sharing knowledge between themselves. And that's the campesino movement in Central America. And in Mexico, following the revolution in 1917, there was established a different form of land ownership, which, over the course of the 20th century, until the legislation was changed in 1994, saw the distribution of almost 50% of Mexico's agricultural lands and forests into the hands of communities as community property. And that has resulted today in Mexico being probably the world's best example of community forest management. And if you look at deforestation in Mexico, I'm going off a slight tangent now, I haven't got time. If you look at deforestation in Mexico, what you'll find is it's much lower in these community-owned and managed forests than it is in their protected area forests, because people have got a stake in the use and management of the forest. It's not being taken away from them, it's being given to them. And so they know that their children will benefit from it, so they'll manage it in a way which is sustainable in the future. Cuba has developed really significantly with agroecology, but because the situation was forced upon them. At the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, they lost their access to cheap fuel and agricultural inputs and technology, as a result of which they had to develop forms of agriculture which were far less reliant on those things. They also had to change the structure of land tenure and give more land back to individual people to farm, groups of people to farm, rather than having it in all large state-owned farms. And a key author here is Fernando Funes Monsotti, who's the son of two researchers. He's got a brother who's another researcher, and he's developed agroecology in Cuba, the discourse of agroecology in Cuba. And any Facebookers, if you want to follow what he does, he has a Facebook page called Finca Mata, which is the small farm that he's set up and developed in Cuba. And so Cuba has seen actually substantial progress towards national food security. They've also found that the damage inflicted by intensive agricultural production has been ameliorated through our agroecology program, and they seem to be increasing their resilience to the impacts of climate change. In Brazil, the MST, the landless workers movement, which has had a lot of, I'm running out of time, so I'm trying to go a bit more quickly now, but since 1984, more than 2,500 land occupations have occurred with the MST. They're not going to fare very well now under new president in Brazil, it has to be said, but when they had the support of Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff following that, they have established 350,000 families on approximately 10 million hectares of land, giving land back to the people who want to farm it. They've established an agroecology school and seed exchange networks. All of this to reduce their dependency on the institutions of the corporate food regime. And I guess they come together, all of these institutions come together, and the person that came to talk to you earlier this year are members of Via Campesina. So established in 1993 as a global movement. That was actually in Mons in Belgium, where they had a first international meeting. But they gained in access to international policy fora. They go to the meetings of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. But they really are claiming a space for themselves on the global stage and position themselves precisely in opposition to the corporate food regime and neoliberal sustainable development, sustainable intensification. So 200 million small farmers.
And they protest. And so here's them saying no to the free trade area of the Americas. Mexico was part of NAFTA and suffered as a result. The farmers suffered as a result. And here they're saying no to the free trade area of America. I don't think it was their success, but we still don't have a free trade area of America. And at the local level, they work with member organisations to facilitate knowledge exchange through the farm-to-farmer processes I noticed earlier. They also have continental scale encounters. The second Americas continental encounter earlier, Camp Casino in 2011, they declared agroecology is ours, it's not for sale. Peasant agriculture is part of the solution to the current crisis of the system. In this context, we reaffirm that indigenous peasant and family farm agroecology can feed the world with cool planet. So I want to show you one final slide now for you to think of, because you've been sitting there and I would assume you've got lots of questions, you want to interrogate them and things I've been saying. So I want to tell you first up my, which will become fairly obvious to you, but my critical stance, my positionality with this. It stems from the idea that there are limits to growth. Environmental sociology is my background discipline. The founding paper in environmental sociology rejects what it calls the human exemptionalist paradigm and says that we must understand that whilst we might be exceptional as a species on this planet, we're not exempt from the natural processes of the planet as a whole. We're in the Anthropocene. Runaway global warming. Food system, global corporate food system, responsible probably for about 50% global greenhouse gas emissions, massive biodiversity loss. The vast majority of that is down to the food system and biodiversity loss, and population growth. The UNFCCC earlier this year said we've got until 2030 to do something serious about climate change. They've been telling us these things since, well, probably since soon after they were established in 1989, but warning about global warming and climate change. And the UNFCCC has just said just last year, 6 months ago, that we've got 11 years now, clock's ticking, to do something about it if we want to try and keep the rise in temperature below 2 degrees C. The FAO, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, in 2009 published something, How to Feed the World in 2050. An estimation of 9.1 billion people, and they said that was going to require a 70% increase in food production net of biofuel production. So taking away the biofuel food feedstocks like sugarcane, maize, soy for biodiesel, palm oil, we've got to produce 70% more food. That really irked the transformative agroecologists because, as they point out, well, this food system, barely 60% of what the global industrial food system produces reaches our plate. Something like 40% of all food produced, and we talk about adding insult to injury, something like 40% of all the food produced never gets to anyone's plate. It's lost in the fields, it's lost during processing, it spoils in the supermarket, so everything goes into landfill. So, as I see it, globalized neoliberalism's goal of unending economic growth is fundamentally incompatible with sustainability, the idea of sustainability. It's incompatible with the laws of thermodynamics, particularly the second law, which refers to entropy and the idea that energy and materials in a closed ecosystem, in a closed system without an external source of energy, that energy dissipates and tends towards an equal distribution. So the sun coming in can organise that. And as long as we work within the capacity of what the sun can bring in, we're fine. But what we're doing at the moment is we're working on the stored capital, fossil fuels, which are basically the sun's energy stored under the ground and transformed over geological time into oil, coal, gas, etc.
And we've been living off that subsidy now for about 150 years, and we're now starting to reap the unintended consequences of it. So for me, global prosperity has got to be based on getting the agricultural system, this is what transformative agroecology says, on getting the agricultural system back to a position where it is the energy system, where it's the system which produces energy. Because we're now well past peak soil. We've used most of the soil, peak diversity, peak oil, we peak everything at the moment, and we've got to find some way to go from here. So I'll leave it there.